Well, a hush has descended, so I take it we're going to begin now. Welcome, everybody, to the Baby Marx Town Hall. I guess the microphone works, so that's a good start. I'd like to, before we begin talking about what the event is going to be like for the next hour and a half or so, introduce who I am. You're probably wondering who's a strange British person, and thank the people who've organized this event in the Walker Art Gallery. As you can see actually in the exhibit that Pedro Reyes, who is sitting over in the back there, has designed, along with the puppets he's designed, the Baby Marx exhibition, which opened 2 days ago with an event that some of you were at with Michael Hart and Lauren Ballon. So my name is Ben Ansell. I teach political science at the University of Minnesota, and what I'm going to be doing today is moderating this debate between two debaters. On my right, Joel Waldfogel from the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota, and on my left, and right and left are going to mean something, as you'll see in a second, Antonio Vazquez-Arroyo from the Political Science Department at the University of Minnesota. I guess you can guesstimate my politics since I'm sitting here in the middle. I'm an antediluvian. I want to thank Pedro for organizing this event in the broadest sense of actually coming up with the idea of Baby Marx. These beautiful puppets, these videos going on the side. If things get tedious for you, you have entertainment to your left. This beautiful library exhibit has had various films starring these puppets filmed over the last few days. So thank you first to Pedro for organizing Baby Marx in the broadest conceptual sense. So, I can't clap with a microphone. I would also like to thank the curators here at the Walker Art Gallery, Bartholomew Ryan and Camille Washington and Susie Bialik, first and foremost, who've been meeting with me and with Pedro over the last few weeks to organize this event, and of course to all the staff whose names I don't know, but you're carrying clipboards and things like that, so I'm assuming you work here. Thank you so much for helping organize and corral people into this event. Okay, so why are we here today? This is a town hall, and the big question of this town hall is a line from a famous Gil Scott Heron, the late now, sadly, Gil Scott Heron poem from 1970 called Comment Number 1. But most people know this poem as the refrain at the end, who will survive in America, who will survive in America? I can't tell you the rest of the poem because it's not fit for public consumption, but you can check it out on Wikipedia and you'll know why I'm not reciting the rest of it. When Gil Scott Heron wrote those words in 1970, on who will survive in America, he was denouncing capitalism in America at that time. He was denouncing imperialism of the mother country, whose accent I have. And he was arguing that America had failed to fulfill its promise. It was now a land, to quote him, of blood and tears instead of milk and honey. So why did we come up with this question today? Well, because we appear to be living through another time of social unrest. As you can tell from my accent, I've watched the riots in London with interest, but it's not just social unrest in London. I was in Madrid a few weeks ago as well, and seeing the encampments in the main squares of Madrid of people protesting against the austerity measures there, in Greece as well, in Portugal, in Ireland, and so on. So we live in a time of social unrest, as Gil Scott Heron did in 1970. But we also live in a time of deep economic uncertainty and unease, much worse, in fact, than in 1970, because, of course, we've possibly exited the worst recession since that of the 1930s. And so the question seems more germane than ever. Who will survive in America? In other words, who are the winners and losers in the American economy? Is capitalism, the economic system that maybe, at least we'll discuss, operates in America, is it to blame for all of our failings? Is it to blame for any of our failings? Is it, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, when talking about democracy, that capitalism is the worst economic system except for all the others? So those are the types of questions we want to talk about today. And those questions were inspired by Pedro Reyes' exhibit. And what Pedro's exhibit does, as you can see around you, is it reanimates a centuries-old debate. Literally reanimates through the form of, well, puppets, as you can see around here. In particular, the debate at its core descends from two main figures. Adam Smith, who is the sort of original expositor and defender of how capitalism works, and then Karl Marx, his most trenchant critic. And so that's the pairing that we're going to be reanimating ourselves today. Adam Smith, to give you my one-liner, although Joel, I'm sure will do a much better job in a second, for Smith, free markets have a near mystical quality in the sense that everybody acting in their base self-interest, nonetheless creates a collective outcome in the economy that's better than the sum of its parts, if you will. It's as if everybody, even though acting for venal, greedy reasons, is guided by, in Smith's famous term, an invisible hand. Okay, so despite our base motives, we end up with the best collective outcome. Marx did not concur. Okay, for Marx, markets were used by the owners of capital, so stuff, productive energy, factories, machines, used by the owners of capital to extract and exploit the labor of workers. So this is an exploitative, alienating process, not one in which what appeared to be individual, venal, mean acts nonetheless somehow produced a good outcome, but one in which individual venal acts were individual venal acts, and the whole system reflected the baseness of the motives. So for Smith, early capitalism was a miracle, and for Marx it was a curse. So with that in mind, what would Smith and Marx say if they were alive today? Or if they were zombie Smith and zombie Marx, zombie Pride and Prejudice, zombie Smith and zombie Marx. Well, we don't have zombie Smith and zombie Marx, which is good, because clearly that would be frightening and disturbing on a variety of levels. We have what I'm going to call the next best thing. I don't know if that's an insult or a compliment. We have Professors Joel Waldfogel from the Carlson School of Management and Antonio Vazquez-Arroyo from the University of Minnesota's Political Science Department. So Joel on my right will represent Adam Smith. On my left, Antonio will represent Karl Marx. I should note, Joel is not representing the Republican Party by any stretch of the imagination, nor is Antonio by any stretch of the imagination representing the Democratic Party. They're representing the philosophies of those two authors as we can understand them today. So let me give you a quick introduction to our two debaters, and I'll shut up pretty soon once I've explained what they know and how this is going to go forward from here. Professor Waldfogel is the author of a couple of wonderfully titled books, including Scroogeonomics, Why You Shouldn't Buy Presents for the Holidays. I will remember this year when my child moans at me and give him that book. And he wrote a book called The Tyranny of the Market, Why You Can't Always Get What You Want. He's going to stand in for Adam Smith as our defender of capitalism as a system that improves what Smith called himself in his famous 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations. Professor Vazquez-Arroyo is the author of dozens of political philosophy articles on post-colonialism, on market and catastrophe, and he's currently drafting a manuscript, is that a fair way of putting it? Entitled Scenes of Responsibility, Power and Suffering in a Post-Political Age. Okay. So both of these authors are much better at titling books than I am. He will represent Karl Marx, who's our opponent of capitalism, who's going to deride its exploitative and destructive nature. And then there's you guys. This is a town hall event. We're not just going to be listening to a bunch of professors barbling away at you. Instead, we'd like you to give us your pointed questions and comments, much in the manner of the kinds of town halls that are going on right now on the congressional recess, where Congress people are exposed to people's thoughts and questions, whether they like it or not. And so we would like to hear your comments, whether we like them or not. The way we're going to do this is, I believe, pass around comment cards if people wish to have them. I'm looking for Bart. Do we have them? We do. Excellent. Okay, so we have comment cards. If you don't want to hear the sound of your own voice, if you don't share my predilection for hearing the sound of your own voice, please feel free to write a comment card and give us your question on that. If you would like to, please feel free to come up to the microphone during the question and answer session and make a comment or a question yourself. So we're going to have 3 sections of the debate, and at the end of each of these sections, we're going to ask for audience questions and comments. And the sections are organized in the following fashion. First, we're going to have the personal, then the national, and then the global. So we'll go from humans to all humans, if you like. In the personal, what we're going to do is examine the lived experience of capitalism. So how does the economic system we live in affect people's day-to-day lives? Does it make them happy? Does it immiserate them? Would we be better off if we lived under the kind of socialist or communist system that Marx advocated, or are we happiest under Smith's envisaged capitalism? Then we're going to move to the national. And here we're going to examine whether American capitalism is working well, or indeed at all. We'll talk about inequality. We'll talk about finance, employment, organized labor. Okay, so those issues about how well the American economy is doing, how well political parties represent, what people want, and so on. What capitalism, as currently exists in America, means for Americans. And then finally, in the global, we'll look at the global economy and ask, is global capitalism in crisis, as Marx, of course, would have it. Our current events going on right now, the fracturing of the euro currency, the indebtedness of not only America, but many major industrial countries around the world, the poverty in sub-Saharan Africa, the environmental destruction in Southeast Asia, and so on, are these indictments of capitalism? Or are these unfortunate but inevitable side effects of the system that on the whole works pretty well? So at the end of each of these sections, I'm going to turn to you guys and ask if you have questions. That's the order of events. Before we come to these questions, I'm going to ask Professor Waldfogel and then Professor Antonio Vazquez-Arroyo. Yeah, I'm sorry. As a man with two middle names, I shouldn't have a problem, but I do.
Just call him.
Carl, over here. Future Carl. Mini Marx. To make opening statements in defense of and in attack against capitalism. And then we'll move to the first question. So I'm going to turn to you, Professor Waldfogel.
Oh, thank you very much, and I guess my microphone's working as well. So I was asked to give a defense of capitalism, and that seemed, well, so defensive. So I thought maybe a rationale for capitalism would be a better sort of topic of discussion. To begin with, I mean, the words capitalism and communism are really such freighted words. I mean, they almost are like playground taunts. I think it's important to define what it is that we mean. So when I talk about capitalism, I think what I have in mind is not the monopoly guy with his top hat, but a system in which individuals, by and large, get to decide what to produce, what to buy. They have the right to strike voluntary deals between themselves and institutions. And they have private ownership of stuff, whatever that stuff might be. Beyond that, economic outcomes, things like how rich various people are, is left largely to the private sphere, or you could say the market, but it's not being decided by some sort of third entity. Communism, by contrast, is a system of centralized decision-making on economic matters. And so that means there are very large restrictions on the kinds of voluntary transactions that individuals can strike with each other. Outcomes are also then meant to be pretty equal. It's not left to the private sphere, but outcomes are really meant to be pretty egalitarian. There's a slogan from each according to his ability to each according to his need, a common sort of slogan used in defense of communism. Now, a question I like to ask is, what would we like our chosen economic system to do? And I think what I would say on that list, among other things, we'd like it to deliver us a healthy and comfortable standard of living. We'd like it to allow us to pursue our happiness and other sorts of interests, perhaps the arts. We'd like the system to allow us to take advantage of technological change and innovation. Those are just, I think, important things that come on my list. Let me illustrate, though, at a kind of nuts and bolts level, what it means for a sort of a system to be working. You know, we'd like it to be undertaking projects that have benefits that are in excess of their costs. Just to be very concrete about this, let's think about, you know, bread. We all eat bread. What would we like to have in the, I won't call it the market for bread because we haven't decided the system yet, but what would we like to have sort of in our consumption of bread? Well, we'd like a situation in which all of the instances in which bread is worth more to its consumers than it would cost society to create, we'd like in all of those instances for it to be brought forth and consumed. That would be efficient. And frankly, we'd like that to happen for all kinds of goods and services. The things that had ought to get done, they should get done. And again, by had ought to, it means they have benefits that are bigger than their costs. Now, broadly, you know, there are two ways we could go about making that happen, and they're, of course, capitalism and communism, or markets and planning, whatever you like, but today we'll call them capitalism and communism. The challenge of doing it through communism is that, well, for starters, there's a really thorny technical problem. We have to figure out, that is, the we is going to be some central planner, has to figure out how much of everything to make, and this is even much worse than just how much of everything to make, but since everything has inputs into it. The bread has flour and yeast and energy and labor, and every other product has all those inputs as well. It's really a rather thorny technical problem to figure out how much of everything do we need to make so that we can make all the final products that we think we want. Right? So that's a hard problem for a planner to solve. Beyond that, the planner, and I know this is boring, but this is sort of economics for a second. You know, what price needs to be charged for everything? Then there are some even harder problems for this planner, this communist planner, to solve. How do we decide who gets what? How do we decide, how do we motivate people to do anything? You know, there's a story, I guess, a phrase attributed to the late period of Soviet communism. You know, a worker says, they pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. How is it that, you know, we get anything done? And without sort of the kinds of financial incentives or resource-based incentives that we are accustomed to in capitalism, which I get to in a moment, how do we get people to work? Perhaps through coercion, which is really less desirable, I think, than voluntary arrangements. I won't say gulags, but coercion of some sort. Now, how about capitalism? Capitalism isn't without its challenges either. It seems chaotic. If we let anyone or everyone do whatever it is that they want, how do we expect anything orderly to come of that? Well, that's where we get to Adam Smith. You know, so what important thing happened in 1776? Anyone know? Well, Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. It was published that year. There's some other things happened that year too, I guess. But the key, and you gave it away actually. But you know, that's all right. Adam Smith's insight, his really key insight, is that there's a lot of order beneath the seeming chaos. A very famous quote attributed to Smith: "It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." It's not quite greed is good, although it's related. The baker makes the bread available if the cost of doing so is less than the price he or she can fetch in the market. The residual he or she gets is some profit, which is their reward for doing it. But notice that what happens is, if they can fetch a price above what it costs, then without any planner intervening, without any communist dictator or whatever, not dictator, but without any, the good outcome we want arises automatically or in a decentralized way. It's not magical, it's just sort of common sense. Now, beyond that sort of wonderful Smith quote, we have to think about some other aspects of Smith that help us think about prosperity. Adam Smith has a long discussion. By the way, Adam Smith's book is by definition, it's a classic because everyone talks about it, but no one has actually read it. And even, I mean, there's a 100-page digression on the price of silver in that book, and I promise you I haven't made it through that whole digression. But there's this famous description of a pin factory. And the pin factory, it's grist for Marx too, frankly, but the pin factory is meant to show that if we produce at proper, or at sort of high scale, we can have much more output for a given amount of input. The notion is, if I make pins on my own, it's a pretty slow process, but if a bunch of us make pins together and we divide up the tasks into cutting the pins and sharpening them and whatever else, that the same number of people per person, we can produce many, many, many more pins. Now, we could ask whether those are interesting jobs, but that's not my side of the debate. The point is, we get a lot more sort of output per unit of input, which means products become cheaper. And most of us, after all, are consumers. And so when Ford rolls out the Model T, and many of us can buy it, that's Adam Smith's pin factory in action, and that's, for the most part, a good thing. A second insight that I think is very important that's post-Smith, but I want to mention it, is just the insight I would attribute to Robert Solow around the mid-20th century, that technological progress is really responsible for the lion's share of the improvement in standards of living over time. And a very important question we want to ask about any economic system we might choose to adopt is, can it adapt to technological change? Can it make use of the innovations that we can come up with, or does it get stuck? You know, and I think about, if the question is, are we doing things through government or markets? Think about in the US right now, there are things that we can't seem to get rid of because of entrenched interests. Imagine if the whole economy were built around entrenched interests and there were no way to adapt or adopt better technologies. So I worry quite a lot about that. But finally, let me just, I know I'm almost done here, but who said the following quote? "People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public, or some contrivance to raise prices." Was that Karl Marx or Adam Smith? Well, it was Adam Smith, which usually surprises my students. My point being that if I'm representing Adam Smith, I want to represent an Adam Smith who is not blind to the challenges associated with markets. He's not a gung-ho, although he's been adopted as an emblem for some gung-ho folks on the right. He really wasn't a gung-ho market nut. And I want to go ahead and equate modern economics with my understanding of Smith and point out that modern economics really do acknowledge that markets are, if wonderful or interesting, still not perfect. There are a lot of challenges in markets, situations in which we don't expect markets to work well, monopoly, things like externalities and pollution, public goods, and we can talk about these in detail if you like. But the point is, I think a proper kind of post-Smithian or Smithian perspective would be that even in a capitalist economy, we expect a pretty substantial role for a government, even if it's not running the bread industry and every other. Now, finally, so how about a little bit of evidence? Wouldn't it be informative to run an experiment? Suppose you're not persuaded yet. How about if we could take a few countries, maybe, and set them up as communist countries, and let it go for a few decades or centuries, see what happens. And of course, the track record here is pretty miserable. The standards of living have been terrible. People typically have been desperate to leave and only through coercion kept inside, while very few people are trying to get in. So, I mean, there's a bit of revealed preference evidence there about the desirability or the success of a system in reality as opposed to in principle. All right, so I should probably wind down. I don't know. I have 0 minutes left, but I'm just about done. So I just want to say that, you know, there are surely some flaws or some shortcomings in free market capitalism. You know, growing inequality, particularly in the US in the last quarter century, has been a real challenge, at least from my personal perspective. But it's important to compare actual capitalism with actual communism, as opposed to, say, comparing actual capitalism with hypothetical communism, you know, in which everyone is happy. And the reason I'm enthusiastic about markets is because, well, at their best, we could say they promote freedom, prosperity, liberty, you know, and, you know, cue the songs. At worst, I think you could say there's no workable alternative, the Churchill quote. So, thanks.
Thank you, Professor Waldfogel. And I now realize I shouldn't spit into the microphone. Professor Vazquez-Arroyo will now present the Marxian perspective.
Marxian, I don't know, that for me that brings
perspective.
images of, I don't know, Mars or something like that without the X. That is to say the planet Mars, as if I had two heads or was green or something like that. So I wouldn't go there. The Pin Factory example kind of reminded me of my freshman year. I actually had nightmares about that growing up, especially you will see in the exhibition there are some red books over there, which are Spanish editions of Mars, so on and so forth, which was a blast in the past. When I walked through, I saw the same books that I read when I was a freshman. But enough of biography. I mean, let me say a few things about capitalism. And, you know, I thought of just laying out 4 specific aspects of it. And one of them is the inevitability of crises as part of capitalist development from the very beginning. The other one is how inequality is not an accident, but is structurally built into the logic of capital. Historically, that has been the case. So if we're going to look into real socialism, let's look into real capitalism too, from the very beginning in England all the way to today. The third one is kind of related to the first two, insofar as there is an actual, I'm not going to use a Marxist phrase here. I'll probably use a phrase from a defender of markets, Joseph Schumpeter, the creative destruction, which I will spin off and say that there is a destructive creation as part of the process of capitalist development, which leads then to the fourth aspect that I want to mention, which is the question of exploitation, for example. But then listening to Joel's intervention, it occurred to me that there is a third one, which is not necessarily obvious, a fifth one actually in this case, and that's the question of freedom. Because it strikes me that that's one of the conceits when people speak about capitalism as if it was a question of freedom, when historically capitalism represents dependence on the market to engage in all kinds of transactions. So market dependence is an attribute of the so-called capitalist freedom, and that constrains some of your choices. Oftentimes I tell my students at the University of Minnesota, you want to go to college. How do you do it? You take student loans. Is anybody putting a gun in your head to sign the line that you have to get in debt to get a college degree? No, of course not. Can you get the education without the loans? The answer is mostly no. And then I go through this little exercise when I say, then you get out of college and you have X amount of debt. And then soon after that, you decide to go to a professional school. And then you accumulate more debt. And then you decide to get married, have 2.5 children, and a white picket fence house, and that's more debt. And by the time that we keep racking up the numbers, we're talking about a significant amount of debt that significantly constrains the forms of freedom that are available within this system of market dependence. So in that regard, for me, it's really interesting because it's all about how exactly do we define freedom in this particular equation, right? If freedom is a question of free choice, well, you know, it's great, sure, which I actually associate sometimes with a rather juvenile ethics. I'm doing this because I want to, not because you tell me so, right? That's what I used to tell my mother up until, well, not that juvenile actually, probably until 25. But the question is, what are the imperatives that are oftentimes depersonalized, that are oftentimes in play, that constrain the choices that you have? Sure, I might choose to do this, but then again, do I really have an option to do otherwise. So that's one aspect that I think is important to keep in mind as we keep in mind some of the other more positive aspects of the form of freedom that capitalism makes possible. Now, moving on to the points that I wanted to make. The first one is crisis. I'm always intrigued by the ways in which capitalist crises are often represented. That is to say, when you read the Wall Street Journal, which I don't, I actually read the Financial Times. It seems to me that is a little bit more interesting in terms of the historical perspective that it gives you, right? But when you read these things, it is as if it is a question of elites run amok in Wall Street or something like that, right? It is personalized in a way in which what is intrinsic to capitalism, the processes of creative destruction that generate these crises are attributed to bad apples, the Bernie Madoffs of the world, so on and so forth, as opposed to seeing them as part of a process in which that is constantly undermining its own foundations, is constantly undermining its own basis. Of course, there is a great deal of technological development, which is why Marx always conceived capitalism as an important stage, as opposed to something that could be sidestepped. And that would be an important component if one were to look at the experiences of actual existing socialism. But maybe we will go there in the national question or not. But the interesting thing is how these crises of profit, in many cases, or over-accumulation, are part and parcel of what capitalism is, to the extent that I will argue that it's a mistake to actually understand the present crisis as a question that, 2008 or even the 2000s or even the 90s, actually. It goes all the way back to the 1970s. So that's one part of the critique of capitalism that I have learned from Marxism. I mean, I don't have a beer, I have an accent, but it's not German, so I cannot do Marx here, right? So for what I have actually learned from Marxism. So the other thing is, I already alluded to, is this process of creative destruction, Schumpeter's phrase, I will call it destructive creation, which is the extent to which a lot of forms of social relations, a lot of resources that were considered to be in commons, like what in Capital Marx talks about the enclosure of the commons. All of these things are destructed, and more importantly, there is a process that I will speak a little bit more on under the label of the personal, of disaffiliation, individualization, right? We take the individual as a given, but this is the outcome of a particular process that then leads to forms of vulnerability in some sectors of the population, which leads to the question of inequality, which is intrinsic to the capitalist system. I mean, one of the contributions, I think, from the Marxist perspective is to understand the violence that forces people to engage into market relations, as opposed to taking the willingness to engage into market relations as the point of departure. That's, once again, the outcome of a particular process, as opposed to just this degree zero or point of departure to understand that. And there is exploitation there. So you will hear me constantly when, is capitalism good? For whom? Well, how does it accept the personal? Which person? Because it seems to me that that goes to the heart of what is at stake here in terms of the critique of what capitalism does, what capitalism doesn't do, and actually the title of the town hall, who will survive in America? Well, I think that there is a specific answer, and is who has the ability to survive vis-a-vis who doesn't. And that is pretty much determined by capitalist social relations, I think. Am I good with time? Yeah.
You are perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Right.
So what we're going to do now is move into the first section, the personal. So as a kind of broad question, as an umbrella question, I thought of this as, what does capitalism mean for people's everyday quality of life? And that's kind of vague enough, but also maybe directed enough to allow a lot of the kinds of questions actually raised by the two opening statements to come into play. Questions about freedom, what freedom means. Questions about how we would be happiest. Questions about whether we have rights other than our political rights, rights that might be forms of social rights. So I'm going to start with some questions like that, but as I do, I'd like you to be thinking of your own questions, because I'm an academic. I'm likely to think of dry academic questions. I'm sure you will have some interesting thoughts. So Please, in about 10 minutes or so, I'll ask for questions from the audience, so please feel free to get up behind the microphone. And if you have written questions during this period, who is collecting the questions? Let me just check. Camille at the back, so if you can sort of pass them backwards, we'll collect some questions too. So that either means everybody has pencils or nobody wants to write questions. The answer to that we will find out in a moment. Let me begin with something that both Professor Waldfogel and Vazquez-Arroyo asked. I'm just going to call you Joel and Antonio from now on. The deference is over. Which was the question of what freedom really means in capitalism and communism. So Antonio remarked that freedom is constrained under capitalism because we're impelled to commoditize ourselves. We're impelled to go and work at someone else's behest in order to earn what we need for things that we would like. And so what kind of freedom is that? The freedom of a convict earning money in a laundry to afford cigarettes in prison. Professor Wald, I'll go with Joel. It's a tick now. Joel, defending economic freedom from the Smith perspective, views the absence of control from some kind of central planner as defining economic freedom, right? People aren't telling me what I have to do with my life. So let me ask both of you to respond to the other's perspective. Starting with you, Joel, to what extent is that Marxist critique that says we're not free because we're forced to work for somebody else to get what we need?
Well, I guess a question would be, what is the alternative? So I suppose we could live as Robinson Crusoe and produce for ourselves. And there is no, I guess, compulsion to go into the market. But if one chooses, instead of just growing vegetables in the backyard, to go and accept an opportunity, that seems, if freely chosen, a superior alternative. Now, of course, there are kinds of transactions that seem less free, even if voluntary. Suppose there's only one employer in town. Then the voluntary choice to go there might be one that comes on very poor terms. But if there are alternatives to choose among, including the alternative of, growing vegetables in one's backyard, I don't see how the opportunity to choose to transact with someone is an abridgment of any freedom.
And Antonio?
Very simple. I mean, I don't think that any critique of capitalism or at least any argument on behalf of a non-capitalist way of understanding freedom is a simplification. Actually, it's the opposite of it. I think that it adds more complexity to many degrees. So it's not a question of having your own garden in your backyard. It seems to me it's about human cooperation. It's about the different forms of dependence that we have. It's about common projects, common goals, and people as a collectivity deciding what are some of the constraints. But because one of the things that strikes me as interesting about this conception of freedom, it is as if constraints are always something negative, but sometimes you have to exclude certain practices which are an enablement for other practices to emerge. It kind of reminds me of this wonderful case in American constitutional history in the 19th century, before there was any kind of labor legislation, in which freedom of contract meant that you should be free to contract to work 18 hours if you want to. If somebody tells you that it should be only 12, they are infringing upon your freedom. Well, that's one way of in which the deregulated freedom works.
So let me follow on that, because I guess the attack on the kinds of phrases that you've used that one could make is, well, whose common goals? And who, I mean, you say it's self-evident that no one would want to work 18 hours a day, but again, who is deciding what's self-evident, and how quickly do we end up on a slippery slope to some kind of central planner deciding on that, perhaps not in fact in the common interest, or maybe there is no such thing as a common interest?
Well, that's the kind of methodological individualism that I think is symptomatic of a capitalist mentality, and that's exactly what I don't take for granted. So in that sense, for me, that's a non-starter insofar as you are already disavowing something that is a historical product. I mean, let me put it this way. You are already naturalizing something that is a historical product, that is to say, this inability to even think about the common good, when historically you can find, even in non-Western societies, instances of self-organization in which people negotiate together. It's not out there to be discovered, right? We're not in the X-Files. The truth being out there is something that is arrived at by people coming together, in which mistakes mistakes are going to be made, of course, in which things are always up for negotiation. But it seems to me that as dependent rational animals, if I can say that, as humans, we're oftentimes involved in relationships of dependence and negotiation with others. So for me to exclude in advance the possibility of any shared common set of goals or endeavors, or taking the individual as if we were Robinson Crusoe, right? To take the individual as the point of departure strikes me as probably not necessarily the most helpful starting point.
So, Joel, do you have economists are methodological individualists, and Smith essentially was as well, maybe the theory of moral sentiments adds some complexity to that, but is there an answer that an economist can give that's not, well, methodological individualism is the best way of thinking about the world, and there are no such thing as common goals?
Well, let me shift it though a bit. Let me just push Antonio a little bit to give us an example of a particular sort of institution or behavior that would represent freedom that somehow is impossible or difficult in a capitalist context, because I frankly didn't understand how the examples illustrated that there were some forms of freedom not available to capitalism.
Well, I can give you plenty of examples. I mean, one of them is, just one. I will give you just one. The fact that even to pass as a modest healthcare bill, that is precisely what provides the basic conditions in which one can exercise freedom in a meaningful way, had to go through everything that it went through in this country, and still it's a pretty pathetic package, if you ask me, right? It's a fairly thin social net. So that in itself is a disavowal. Second of all, you have, when I live in Massachusetts for a long time, you can still have these small cooperatives, so on and so forth, but those are pockets that actually they can organize, they can be self-owned by their workers, but they're still constrained to deal in terms of profit and capital relations with other enterprises. So those are just two things that come to mind that show you what are some of the structural constraints that are in place when market transactions become the arbiter or the final arbiter to adjudicate on all these questions.
But the specific sense in which you used the term freedom in your first example was the freedom to have stuff without paying for it. Now, these may be things that we had ought to be providing for each other, but I think that that's not so much, I mean, if your notion of freedom is that it would be nice to provide things for everyone, that's a kind of fairy tale notion. That's not really freedom. I mean, that's just, let's manufacture things out of air and give them to people.
Well, you should ask the Cubans. They've been living on a fairy tale on healthcare for 40 years.
Should I respond?
Please go ahead and respond.
No, so let me try to be kind of fair-minded academic about this. It is the nicest thing one can say about Cuba is that the distribution of consumption and income is not very unequal. The average standard is exceedingly low, but the least well-off person compared to the best well-off person gets pretty good health care in Cuba. But if you look at the average income in Cuba is maybe a tenth or less than a tenth of what it is in the US. So if you imagine yourself, as the least well-off person in society, you might prefer on a sick day to be in Cuba. But I think to rely on Cuba as an example of a form of kind of healthcare, well, freedom delivered by healthcare from the sky, it's a poor example. But that said, in the U.S. we could solve our healthcare problems quite simply, quite simply, and it's not really a problem of capitalism, it's a problem of democracy.
So, Antonio, let's get to this issue about Cuba. I mean, I'm sure you're going to want to respond on that front, but let me just...
No, actually don't. Yeah.
Okay, then let me just ask you my own slightly searching question, which is there a freedom to be an entrepreneur that is essentially banned within the communist, both theoretical and as lived in Cuba experience? And is that something that you should be concerned about? The example of somebody who would like to open a cafe that their friends and neighbors can come to and purchase food from seems innocuous to most Americans, and yet is tricky in a system that bans private property. It's not obvious how that would work. Or perhaps it is.
Well, the main reason that I said, no, I don't want a response is that, Cuba is one of these things in which most people know nothing about, but we all have an opinion on, right? So one thing, for example, to keep in mind is the fact that what you just described that is not allowed, is actually allowed, and it's happening right now. In the case of Cuba, you have all these forms of, that's part of what happened after the special period, is part of what they are trying to look for and liberalizing, and some of those areas to have those kinds of incentives. So the problem in of itself has never been a problem against entrepreneurship or anything of that sort. That's actually to miss as the American expression goes, right? It will be missing the forest for the trees, so to speak, right? I think that what is truly at stake is a basic social safety net, so to speak. So basic social rights that are anchored on human needs. We're not talking about anything too abstract here. We're talking about questions of education, questions of the right to work, for example, questions of healthcare, so on and so forth, which quite frankly are not a question of, I think that those are some basic things that for all that people talk about human rights, they often forget about those specific human needs that are crucial to have any meaningful collective life in which people can meaningfully exercise freedom in different capacities. So entrepreneurship, sure, there is a space for that right now in places like Cuba. But to be honest with you, I'd rather focus on who survived in America than talking about Cuba. I just didn't use Cuba as the paradise of any particular social formation or anything along those lines. I just brought it up. He asked me for concrete examples, so I actually brought up that one particular case, which again is nothing very original. I mean, all you need to do is to watch Sicko with Michael Moore, and you will get the whole spiel about Cuba and healthcare, so on and so forth.
So let me broaden this to a discussion of whether there's such a thing as social rights. I mean, Smith himself thought there was a government role in providing public education, which sounds a lot like a social right, and presumably that is getting something for nothing in the phrase you used earlier. So, to what degree I'm not sure if this is a critique of you or a support of the capitalist position here, but are we missing the forest for the trees by talking about social rights to health and education, which maybe a capitalist could agree on as much as a communist, as opposed to stuff, right? Because it seems to me that a broader difference between Cuba and America, and I don't want to keep harping on Cuba here, is markets in goods, markets in services, as opposed to these basic rights. Antonio, do you have a position you'd like to take on whether we should have state-owned production of goods and services that we use? And Joel, would you have a position on where to draw a line on social rights, and really if an understanding of markets tells us enough about that?
Well, I mean, if there is one lesson, now, speaking in all fairness here, right, there is one lesson from the experience of the 20th century, and actually from a particular phase of the Cuban Revolution, is precisely for some of the reasons that Joel alluded to, how to fix prices and to have this overly centralized, state-centered type of economy is a mistake. I mean, that's part of one of the many reasons, one of the many things that went wrong in the former Soviet Union, and it was part of a bureaucratization of political and economic life, and that's something that was extremely detrimental, right? So we're not necessarily talking here about centralization of things, which is, of course, how a capitalist will see it, and it's exactly how Joel sees it, of course. But what we're talking about here, it seems to me, is the question of leaving all these vital things into the market. The question of market dependence, the question of whether or not this should be relegated to the sphere of the private vis-a-vis to be important public goods.
So if I may just expand on the question I was going to give you, Joel, about social rights, why not give everybody a basic income of $100,000 and then let the market rip?
Well, that one really is an example of the resource fairy solving problems simply by manufacturing resources. But under the watchful eye of Milton Friedman over there, in the red tie and turquoise jacket, let me give the Milton Friedman perspective, which is not my own and frankly not Smith's either. He would say, I think, were he alive, that everything that had ought to get done can be done by free individuals dealing with each other, because if there's a willingness to pay that's in excess of the cost of providing it, then it can happen. If it should happen, it will happen. And he would say that pretty aggressively about many things that we customarily rely on government for. He would say that about education. He would say that about healthcare. He would say that about the Postal Service, many, many things. I think a more nuanced and more representative of kind of the modern economic perspective would be to say that well, let me not even implicate economics, but just say the way I think about this, which is make a list of things you think had ought to happen in your society. And then the question is, well, how many of them can happen if we on autopilot? You know, we pretty much think the bread problem can be solved on autopilot, and it's interesting that Cuba has decided that as well for restaurants. But maybe healthcare isn't one of those. Now, one kind of could ask the question, why might that be? And there are, I think, even some sort of legitimate technical kinds of reasons why that might be. I mean, a simple reason is just inequality, but I think a more sophisticated reason is that, you know, insurance markets are complicated in the sense that people tend to know more about their health status than the seller of the insurance. And so if you're a seller of insurance, you know, you sort of get bad apples coming to you. And so it really can make things better if you kind of compel people to buy together in groups. But, you know, that's a bit of an inside baseball kind of point. But I guess the point is, and I think this is a point of probably more like consensus than disagreement, is that if one makes a list of things one thinks one society had ought to do, even using the criterion, do things where the benefit's bigger than the cost, I think the pro-capitalist perspective here would be a lot of it will get done on autopilot, but some of it won't, and that's the stuff you're going to need government for.
Let me, unless you have a point you'd like to follow up with.
No, very briefly.
And then we'll move to questions after Antonio's point.
Very briefly, just to highlight one thing, that it is precisely framing the question in terms of costs and benefits that is an upshot and a symptom of a capitalist way of addressing these questions, as opposed to what Joel takes the most simple answer, for me is the more complicated one, is equality as a value that defines any collectivity, right? So for me, that's the overriding concern, and precisely to be able to hold on to that commitment, even if it is not profitable by market standards. But then again, to hold on to that commitment, even if it is not profitable, means thinking outside of a market-oriented logic.
Let me see if there are people who, have you collected questions at the back? No. So would anybody like to address us with questions? Or would you like me to just let these guys rip and roar a little bit longer? Go ahead, Pedro.
I'm curious to see, I mean, coming from Mexico, the debate who will survive America, I don't feel like I'm in a I mean, like I'm part of the debate, but I'm also feel concerned because of all the Mexican population that lives in the United States, as well as our relationship sharing a border. And I think that, for instance, it seems that we're focusing the critique of capital in general, and I think that there's like certain practices within capitalism that are much more worse than others. And I wonder if the model of capitalism is something that could fix these worst practices, or if of capitalism itself has an intrinsic incapability to fix that. And what do I mean by these worst practices? I don't know. For instance, I think of weapon trade, and like every day there's 2,000 weapons that come into Mexico. 90% of all the weapons that are coming into Mexico come from the United States. So I see, for instance, that you have like military industry, which you can see the stock. They are all public financial companies that you can invest on, and it's like something that seems to be like a freedom here, but that across the border this is causing like a terrible bloodshed. Or for instance, like I don't know, like genetically engineered seeds that will only grow if you have a fertilizer from Monsanto, or I don't know, like planned obsolescence in Apple computers, where it's like the reason why it's a company that is so profitable is because everything is designed to fail within 2 years. So, you know, like these are like kind of this is like intrinsically built into the capitalist model because it's based on profit making. But the side effects, the externalities of all this market model we'll end up with the planet, I don't know, like a few centuries from now. So I wonder if we pose the question, I mean, like, I think in terms of good, perfect as the enemy of good, in terms of, okay, I don't want to think in a utopic model, which perhaps feels like too far, but I think that how do we tame the evil or the worst practices of capitalism? Is that possible, or just it's simply not?
I'd be happy to take debate. So a lot of interesting examples there. Let me give a different example that I think is consistent with what you're saying, and you can stop me if it's not. I mean, think about the example of some productive activity, but which is polluting, which, in the course of making some product, so there's some pollution. The air or the water gets polluted. And so how do we think about that? If private firms are left on their own, then essentially what they're doing is they're using an input, clean air, and they're not paying for it. And so the costs that the firm faces and that it needs to cover with the price of the product isn't really the full cost to society. So left on its own, we actually would expect too much of this product to be produced because not all the full costs are being internalized or being incorporated. And the question is, what can we do about that? So that's an example of a situation in which we expect markets to fail. Right? And that's an orthodox contemporary economic perspective. That's not a Marxist perspective, although it may be consistent with one. And the question is, can we solve this problem? Are there institutions available? Can we solve it? And I think the answer is that yes, but we need to use some sort of governance. We have to have some either regulation or, better still, markets for the right to pollute, things like that, so that we force the producer to face the full cost. So again, it's not just about sort of paper profits, but we have to think about the full costs and benefits of the things that we're doing. We need to make firms and individuals face the full costs and benefits of what they're doing so they make the right decisions on their own. So, but your deeper question, can we sort of solve problems like this only through the creative design of institutions and some kind of intervention in the situations where we just can't expect markets to work on their own? But we do see things like this. I mean, we do see rights to pollute being issued. We see, tradable permits and so forth. I mean, we're not there because we don't have international agreements on all these kinds of things, but there are ways of getting these problems solved.
That's a great question, Pedro. And one issue that I wanted to, and I would like to discuss when we get to the global part is precisely ecological questions, right? Which go to the heart of what you're talking about. Very briefly, I think that there are ways in which historically, at different moments, a lot of these market imperatives have been reined in, or at least trying to be curbed. But always, and I mean always with full certainty, is a compromise forced from below. That is to say, it's never that all of a sudden the capitalist elites or the governing elites have a moment of enlightenment and they realize that the cost of these things might be too high, socially too high. It is oftentimes mobilization, pressure from below, which precisely leads to these settlements, to these compromises. In the case of the US, of course, you have these from the New Deal on, and even the Great Society, and then part of what we see today, which is what makes a lot of these governmental interventions either less likely or somewhat more conservative in their boldness, lack of boldness, as it were, right, is precisely the lack of that kind of pressure, which is what leads to it. So, another thing is that for a long time in the 20th century, capitalism, precisely because it was in an ideological battle with this other enemy, communism, had incentives to reform itself precisely because there was an alternative to it in the political field that had appeal for a lot of people. Right now, given the absence of that alternative, the incentive to reform are increasingly unlikely, and in the absence of real pressure from below, is even less likely that some of these compromises will take place. And I think that becomes really clear when you start to discuss questions like global warming, questions like the impending ecological disaster, so on and so forth, which are really tough questions that relate to that. I don't know if that more or less addresses what you were asking. But.
We have another question.
My question is unfortunately quite similar, but it goes a little bit further. Obviously, from your introductory remarks, both systems, economic systems, have some problems. So capitalism produces inequality and tendency towards crisis. Communism has a fundamental problem with resource allocation and fostering technological change. Now, we've sort of dealt with how capitalism deals with some of these problems, but at a more fundamental level, I'd like to see some sort of a discussion about which system is more able to be modified to solve these fundamental problems while still functioning in a coherent and beneficial way. So we heard that, at least from an economist's perspective, that capitalism can be modified to solve things like inequality, obviously through resource redistribution, and crisis maybe through some sort of government intervention. But communism, I'm still unclear as to how communism is supposed to solve the fundamental resource allocation problem and foster technological change. So maybe we could hear more about how communism can be adapted to solve its fundamental problems, even though we heard a little bit about capitalism already.
Yeah, well, there is a reason for that, I think. And what the main reason being that the whole idea of the town hall was, I think, to think about who will survive in America, which is a capitalist society, and what will be the critique to that, which is why I think that has been the focus. Now, the question is, what can we learn from the experience of the 20th century? Well, I think that one of the communist, so-called socialist experience is precisely that a state-centered model of any alternative to capitalism lends itself to bureaucratization, to that kind of lack of mobility, to that kind of lack of flexibility that precisely led to its downfall. And one need not be a capitalist to understand that, unless you are an unreconstructed Marxist, right? You will not acknowledge any of that, and you will think that it was some kind of sabotage from the outside. But I think that there is something to be said about that particular experience. And what is really symptomatic, I think, is that the few times in which a more dynamic, more decentralized attempt to bring about forms of non-capitalist economic, social, and political organizations, in many cases that were cracked down from within, precisely because of these entrenched, bureaucratized, state-centered elites. And it seems to me that any reckoning with a future beyond capitalism has to own up a little bit to that particular experience, learn from it, to precisely move in a slightly different direction. I mean, that would be my short answer to that.
Do we have any other questions right now? Yeah, please go ahead.
I guess one question that keeps coming back to my mind during this is, how do people think about the role? Is there a place anywhere in the present hyper-capitalist mode for such a thing as the greater good? Because the things that, I think the Adam Smith arguments have been really used in such disingenuous ways lately, as if the marketplace is somehow neutral and it's just people can do what you want without the so-called nanny state or something, and then they say the alternative is this centralized, bureaucratized thing. And it's maddening, because the unconscionable split between rich and poor, corporations being considered as people. I mean, what's going on, all of the positive examples that were given of what capitalism can achieve, things like infrastructure, New York subway system, public transportation, bridges that don't fall down, whatever those things are, were all set up during a time when there was at least still some notion somewhere of a greater good. So you could say that the early capitalists, who would now probably be considered socialists in the present Congress, were trying to make something that they perceived as a possibly sustainable system. And the bald-faced kind of self-interest going on now is just so clearly not working. I understand that there's disappointments in communist countries, okay? But I just keep thinking of this old saying that was popular during the, when Zimbabwe independence movement was first starting up, when they were coming out from under Rhodesia, is they said, every time we try to talk about popular majority rule, we're told, well, you don't want to go there because there's these communist regimes that are really problematical. And what Nkomo said at that point was, okay, imagine a hyena has you by the leg. He is sucking your blood and you are dying. And every time you try to get away, he says, you don't want to get away. There's a lion somewhere over in those hills and he could be dangerous, okay? So I think somewhere this notion of the greater good has to come into the equation, because that's really sorely lacking in the present economic context now. And they keep using the Adam Smith argument as a justification. So that's why I'm having a hard time hearing this as if it's hypothetical, and it's really not hypothetical. The human stakes are horrible, okay?
I agree. Thanks. Joe, would you like to respond to that? Since,
Sure.
I'm going to guess it was aimed more in your direction.
No, that's fine. And let me give an example. I think I'm pretty sympathetic to the comment, actually. But let me just give an example of some things that we do currently do that I think reflect a concern for that. You know, maybe we don't do enough and so forth. But let's think about the example of educating children. You know, between the ages of 5 and 16 or so, by law, kids have to be in school. And every jurisdiction I know of not only finances, but actually provides that activity. And it's very expensive. I mean, we spend a great deal of money in this country through government, you know, collectively through government doing this. Now, unfortunately, we don't seem to be doing it as well as we might. But I think there's a recognition in the fact that we do that, and a number of other examples, that we do have some things that we need to get, that we won't just leave to the market. I mean, it's a little bit curious. Why don't we just, you know, again, there's Milton Friedman. What he would say, and again, I don't necessarily agree with him, well, here's an activity where people can be excluded, which means the sellers could charge for it. And, you know, if my kid's in there taking up a seat, your kid can't be in the same seat. So that's a classic private good. You know, in a very purely market context, that would be a purely market-provided activity. There would be no public finance and no public provision. And yet, we do not only finance, but provide it through government. So I think there remains a pretty significant recognition that we're not going to let individuals decide for themselves. There are some activities or some things we want to have done that we're so concerned about that we won't let the market do it. I mean, there are others, curiously, where we don't. We don't seem to care as much about healthcare. You know, we're willing to let the market take care of that one by and large. But so maybe not as much as you like, but it's not as though a concern for outcomes beyond what the markets do is missing from our system entirely. Oh, no, I'm agreeing with you. I'm saying we don't do it in healthcare. It's curious to me that we do it for kids who are, we don't do it for kids who are under 6. We do it for kids 6 to 18 or so. And then after that, you've got to borrow money to continue in school. So it's a little curious, the context in which we decide to versus not deciding to. But there are some pretty significant contexts in which we do decide to do it, you know, against Milton Friedman's advice.
No, very briefly, I think that, you know, you're absolutely right in pointing out the historical differences from previous moments, right, in which the common good, quote unquote, still figure as part of the agenda. And I think there is an explanation for that. I mean, the white elephant in the room is neoliberalism, which is, I think, a term that people often don't like. But it captures something very significant, which is the unraveling of these compromises that precisely consider the question of the common good, which can be dated to what I initially referred to processes of disaffiliation during the late 70s, early so-called Thatcher, Reagan, and then the more benevolent versions, which were actually worst, of Clinton, Blair, so on and so forth. So it seems to me that what you see is an increasing disappearance, not entirely. I think Joel is absolutely right. There are pockets in which this is still figures, right? But compared to, say, 30, 40 years ago, it has shrunk significantly.
So let me take the points that both debaters have made and the gentleman from the audience and use them as a segue into the next section on capitalism in America, because this brings up one of the questions that I wanted to address here, which is America really a capitalist country? Were we more presumably, since government is now 30–40% of GDP, depending on whether one includes local and state and so on, whereas it used to be 5% in the 1920s, were we once a capitalist country? Are we now a capitalist country? What has worked better for Americans? And start with you, Antonio,
sure.
and then move to John.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that the answer is yes, it's a capitalist country if there ever was one, right? And this is what I have in mind. I mean, when you look at the history, the trajectory of the US, you can see a big turning point in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, which increasingly led to the industrialization and the standardization of the American economy, to the extent that I think it became the quintessential capitalist country. Of course, going back from the abstraction into the concrete instantiation, one very interesting thing about capitalism is that, contrary to the common held view that capitalism is anti-state or that capitalism is in of itself more pro-democracy, I mean, one of the fascinating things about capitalism is its ability to adapt itself to particular contexts, and we will talk a little bit more about that later on with one of the questions. So I think that indeed there has been a structural dependence on capitalism and the state, from deregulation, which is another form of regulation, to more active forms of regulation. And it seems to me that what has changed is the role of the state in the capitalist economy. But I don't think that makes the US less capitalist today. Actually, I will say that the other way around. Precisely when there were some programs like the Great Society or the New Deal, so on and so forth, in which there was an attempt to have a little bit more like a mixed economy. It was closer to something like looking like a mixed economy vis-a-vis now, which it seems to me that is closer to unfettered capitalism. Yeah.
Joel?
I think it's clearly, the US is clearly a very capitalist country, but I guess 2 points that come to mind. One is that the nature, the extent of government involvement in markets varies over time, as Antonio said, in part to reflect things that are happening in our democracy. So I think that the system's elastic enough to develop ways of dealing with perceived and real problems. A second point, though, that's more recent and in some ways more fundamental, one of the ideas that capitalism, as I described it, is based on is that people are in positions to make informed choices, these free informed choices. But what if people actually aren't in a position to make good choices? And interesting, think about the financial crisis and what regulatory responses are being contemplated in response. I mean, one of the big concerns is that people were offered mortgages without really being properly educated about the terms of those mortgages, and so perhaps people shouldn't be allowed to make, quote, free choices, because it's not that they're coercive, it's just that they're complicated and people aren't in a position to strike some bargains. And so if one takes that perspective, the concern that people are actually not able to make good choices for themselves, that's a recent and really in some ways more fundamental challenge to capitalism. I'm not quite sure why I'm saying that, given where I'm sitting up here. But it is an interesting development in economics, and this whole trend called behavioral economics. It's taken economists a long time to learn that people are in some sense idiots and need a little bit to be protected from themselves. So anyways, that's an interesting challenge that does raise questions about possibly additional protections or regulatory responses needed to prevent people from harming themselves.
So on this subject matter of the interplay between American government and American markets, I still take it as the position of the heirs of Adam Smith and the economics profession that governments exist to more or less restrain or guide markets. But in Antonio's position, that's not quite what the government is doing. Government seems to be promoting or creating markets. So is the US, in your line, it seems that the US government is part and parcel of US capitalism, as opposed to some kind of bulwark against it.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, at least, corporate power and political power have been colluding with each other for decades now. And I think that's fundamentally the case now, and that in a way limits what are some of the available choices in terms of what to do with the current crisis, for example. So I think that the relationship is more along those lines these days, absolutely.
Please go ahead.
I
Yeah.
Okay. The example about predatory lending I thought was an interesting one because you mentioned, is it the job to save people from being foolish? But predatory lending didn't just happen. That was not an accident. That was really a designed program. The same interests that used to redline whole inner city neighborhoods of these people not being able to get good insurance rates or mortgages and stuff like that. These same poor neighborhoods were recently specifically targeted as a designed principle to say, sell these people mortgages that they won't be able to afford. You know, here's how you do this. I mean, there were all kinds of training sessions about how to make that happen. That was not just a failure, that was intentional. Okay.
If I might jump on top of that, I guess one interesting tweak to that would be to say those people were only able to sell those mortgages because the government purchased mortgages. You know, Fannie and Freddie didn't necessarily purchase subprime mortgages, but because of governmental regulation in that market. So we have this, you know, the question to me is, and maybe Antonio can respond to this, was this kind of behavior something that happened in the market or something that happened because the market and government interact in strange ways?
Well, in strange ways, that's one way of putting it. I mean, I think that they, at the end of the day, the ways in which, you know, you and some of my other colleagues here know more about this than I do, but the ways in which political institutions are set up, the ways in which campaigns are run, so on and so forth, all of these things create the conditions for this collusion of capitalism with corporate power. And it seems to me that what happens in many cases is, of course, there are always blunder and unintended consequences. I mean, I'll be the last person to suggest that everything is masterminded here, right? So in that regard, I think that in many cases there was some foolish legislation or lack of sound legislation, but it seems to me that, I mean, it seems pretty obvious to me given the response that the government had. I mean, I remember this line from Obama as soon as he took over power saying, like, if we don't intervene, the crisis is going to be catastrophic and we need to pass all this bailout money, which, you know, is not as the slogans and the bumper stickers say, you know, we're bailing out the banks, but, you know, the people are not getting bailed out, so on and so forth. So it seems to me that there is a fundamental interest between the two. Even the coverage that was offered of this debt ceiling thing, which was quite hyperbolic to a degree. I mean, you know, the stakes were high, but not that high, and yet it was used to sort of like present this pseudo-catastrophic scenario in which a lot of the, precisely what is the relationship between even the idea of the credit rating. I mean, that for me, if you want a proof of whether or not we live in a capitalist society, think about the fact that that is an overriding concern. As, you know, which for me is like, who cares about it, right? But, you know, in our case, of course, we are all obsessed with our credit rating, right? And the government has to be obsessed with the credit rating. Why?
Joel, do you have a response? Since Antonio has asked a question. Or left a question hanging.
I will do that from now on. I just ask questions, yeah.
Works for me.
There was so much there, I'm not sure which thing to say. So I'll reserve my minutes for later.
Should governments have credit ratings and care about them? Is that a tyranny of the market, to quote your own book?
Well, no. I mean, to the extent that the government's credit rating determines the rate at which the government can borrow, it's going to affect costs that we all incur. So this would be caring about this would be an example of concern for the greater good. So that sounds like. So I mean, it strikes me that it is something that a government ought to worry about.
Let me ask you a question about the functionality of markets in finance in America over the last 10 years. Is a financial system that depends more or less on implicit or, as it in fact turned out, explicit government bailouts or government support really an effective capitalist form of financial system? Is this something where we really could ever let markets run amok, or is it something that has to be regulated?
You know, it's a tough question. I mean, because once you're in a crisis, then you have people saying, probably believably, that if we don't do something, we'll have a horrible situation for all of us. So that said, you know, going forward, everyone always argues, I think with some justification, that we have to sort of pledge credibly never to bail out so that people don't behave irresponsibly. But then we bail out. And so it's really, it's, you know, it's capitalism on the way up and socialism on the way down.
I wanted to ask a more political question, and a partisan political question, not asking you to vote in front of us, but a question about the relationship between democracy or party politics in America and the range of possible ways of organizing one's economic system. Now, I come from a country where the right-wing party is maybe to the left of the left-wing party in America, and that's Britain.
Yeah.
Let alone the rest of Europe.
Yeah.
Right. In Italy, the communists get a publicly subsidized TV station. So, I presume from a Marxist perspective, you're going to tell me that this is not the range that it could be, but I'd like your thoughts about party politics in America and their possible connection to this.
Well, no, I mean, I think that it's fairly, it's funny because, of course, I've lived in this country for 11 years, but not being from here, I've always been amazed about how little separates the political parties and how much of a big deal people make out of it, right? And I'm always tempted to say that there is, that people confuse style with substance, right? But that would be too self-satisfying in a way, although, it's not the worst thing, right? But I think that part of the problem is that there is no fundamental difference in terms of how these two main parties, the donkey and the elephant, so to speak, right, how they actually see the ways in which collective life, economic life, capitalism constitutes a form of power, right? You don't see necessarily any fundamental difference there. I mean, usually I was always somewhat amused if it wasn't serious. I mean, at the moment, but I was somewhat amused about this hysteria with George W. Because in many respects, there was a great deal of continuity between him and Clinton. It's just like Clinton seemed like a nicer guy. Clinton was playful and he did his thing. And, we kind of like always had that ambivalent relationship to good old Bill, right? Vis-a-vis the cultural politics of somebody like Bush, which is not to say that on specific fundamental issues that make a difference on people's lives, right? That there is no difference between having the two. Of course, one fundamental set of issues are those that have to do with religious views, especially women's reproductive rights, so on and so forth. So that's not negligible. But it seems to me that when it comes to capitalism in this country, they are fully embedded into this collusion of corporate political power, more so than anywhere in the world. I mean, actually, I hate the Spanish Socialist Party, but is on the left of anything here. And that is in of itself a fairly tamed, compromise, entity these days, just to give you one example.
So, Joel, from the perspective of a neoclassical economist, without wishing to pigeonhole you there, so you can either take that perspective or have it as yours, are there differences between the donkey and the elephant? Right? So Mitt Romney appears on stage 2 nights ago and says, we are an inch away from the end of American capitalism. So to what extent is there an element of truth in that?
That he said it? Or
Define inch.
Well, it is campaign. It's it's the primary season, so people say a lot of crazy things. One thing that's curious. So 2 points. One, kind of an inside baseball point. In a two-party system, the two parties both kind of govern toward the middle to try to get at least half of the voters to vote for them, especially during the general election season. So in a two-party system, we do have this very centrist-looking pair of parties. But I think it is curious. We are unusual in that we have very small differences. But beyond that, we've just lived through, or we're still living through, the biggest economic, crisis, recession since the Depression. Last time around, a few generations ago, there was a lot of critique from the left. This time, who's exercised? The far right. And their concern is that government is too big. So it's interesting, again, this is probably one that should be coming from the other side or from the middle or something, but it's just very curious. We're living in a situation in which, we've had this real crisis, and the debate isn't about whether capitalism is functioning poorly or correctly, but rather whether sort of government has gotten out of control. And I think there's a lot to be said on both sides of that, but it is curious.
Since because this debate has been so interesting, taken a decent amount of time on these first 2 sections, I thought what we might do is start talking about global capitalism in crisis as a broad question, since Joel just mentioned it, and we've been talking about the financial crisis. And then, once we've opened that up, start opening up to some audience questions, both about America's place in the world and global capitalism. So I want to return to Antonio and say, Do you consider the events between 2008 and today a crisis in capitalism or part of an ongoing crisis in capitalism?
I think it's the most dramatic phase of an ongoing crisis that you know one can trace back to a crisis of accumulation more than anything else. I think that one can trace all the way back to the 70s, and it seems to me that we bought some time away from this more critical phase through the different bubbles, the housing bubble, the credit bubble in the 90s, so on and so forth. And it seems to me that this is just an exacerbation, or at least when the bubbles burst, right? This is an exacerbation of an ongoing crisis. And do I think that capitalism will find a way to get out of it? Most likely. I mean, if there's any enemy of capitalism, has to acknowledge the uncanny ability of capitalism to consistently rebuild itself, right? So in that regard, I'm not saying that this is a final crisis, that the end is near or anything like that. That would be idealistic, if nothing else, right? But I do think that this is just the most critical phase of an ongoing crisis that can be traced all the way back to the 70s, I think.
And so, Joel, from your perspective, is the period of non-crisis, let's say, between 2000 and 2008, was that a real period of non-crisis, or are the bubbles part and parcel of the collapse, and therefore is there something more systemic going on here?
Well, I would say there was something systematic going on, but I'm not sure that I would think of it as a systemic feature of capitalism. It's more a systematic feature of human beings to occasionally forget and begin to think that appreciating house values are going to happen forever. To forget the things that can't rise forever, won't rise forever. I mean, it is remarkable that when you think about what happened, how few people seem to understand it. It's probably not right. It strikes me as very wrong to think of it, and nobody's saying that it is, but to think of it as some sort of elite conspiracy. I think that there was just a lot of complexity in financial instruments. The things that Warren Buffett called financial instruments of mass destruction, and just a lot of the sort of hysteria that occasionally happens. But I don't think of it as any kind of a reason to systematically like or dislike capitalism. It's more just human folly.
Do we have any questions at this point, since we've been going back and forth for a while? Please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about human folly, and that is, from my point of view, there's been an incredible effect of concentrated wealth on the shape of democracy. And there has been an enormous amount of planning to alter the outcome of elections, the election of congresspeople. There are lobbyists. There are all manner of ways in which we've ended up in the position that we're in. And the idea that somehow, it's just human greed as a pervasive human characteristic rather than a very complicated capitalistic form of American hustle that gets ever more sophisticated it's dangerous to think in that way, because that way you end up saying about the person who signs a bad mortgage, well, what's the matter with you? And you end up with a system where a lot of people feel like they're losers because they're not smart enough to play the game, when in fact there's a structure that is set up to turn them into people who are nervous about being losers and whose kids get a lousier education rather than a better education, and that's somehow their fault. So I'd like someone to talk about that nexus of issues.
I mean, I agree in many respects, meaning that it goes back to this question of individualism, right? Because it seems to me that one of the trends in the last 30 years or so is to increasingly focus on the individual. So it's a question of individual responsibility or irresponsibility. As And, you know, it seems to me that that is part of a larger process that's, you know, for instance, in some European countries, in France, for instance, and even in the US, of actually, I will even say disaffiliation in the sense of thinking in individual terms, just like we think in individual terms as, you know, the Bernie Madoffs of the world, as if it wasn't something more complicated, as you suggest, right? And so it seems to me that that is part of a depoliticization, which goes back to something Joel just said. I mean, is kind of, I'm always amazed by the fact that it is the right who is actually making noise in this particular crisis, right? And the hysteric reaction of some liberals to that, as if somebody needs to censor them. And I always say, just meet them head on. What's the problem? You know, they are just organizing, they're doing their thing, you do your thing and meet them head on, as opposed to this almost moralist standpoint in which, how dare they to organize the Tea Party, so on and so forth. So it seems to me that that is, I mean, what you point out is a symptom of a trend that has to do, I think, with the individualization of both success and failure. Because I remember that the cool idea of the 90s was to be a dropout of some Ivy League and then invest money in California or something like that, and then you become a billionaire. A Mark Cuban, right, a billionaire. And if you don't, somehow that became, well, if you know, the bootstrap story, right? Just like success, it seems to me, has become increasingly individualized, so does failure, to a degree. And for me, that's once again symptomatic of some of the larger transformations that have taken place in the last 30 years or so.
So I guess one point that the comment makes me think about, and reminds me of something I've been thinking a bit throughout all this, is, you know, we can trot out bad things that have happened in our memory, and of course by construction those are things that are happened in our memory in the US and capitalist system. Are those indictments of capitalism, or are they just bad things that we know to have happened? Because we always have to ask, well, you know, compared to what? So yes, this funny thing happened, this bad thing happened, that bad thing happened, but is it a feature of the particular system we are living in, or is it something that might have happened or might have happened much worse in other contexts? So let me just leave that out there and maybe return to it.
Well, let me answer the question compared to what with the statement compared to China. We have a country that people used to talk about as a rising power that is now the second richest country in the world, no matter which way you value the currencies. And yet it's an allegedly communist country that seems to be doing quite well as a capitalist country. So what role do you think China is playing in the global economy right now? Antonio, do you think it is a communist country, or you know, a wolf in sheep's clothing, if you will?
No, I think it's more complicated than that, in the sense that I think that China represents something like a historical novum. I mean, something new, in the sense that you have a market, a lot of elements in the economy that are market economy, capitalist elements, and at the same time you have a centralized state structure that is very repressive of their own workers, actually, by the way. You know, so there is a lot of repression and cracking down on workers in a workers' state, quote unquote, right? So in that regard, for me, what is really interesting about the case of China is that it debunks the idea that somehow capitalism has some affinity with forms of democracy, however tame they are. Because, you know, we know that some of the initial neoliberal agendas were developed in Chile, for example, under Pinochet, right? An authoritarian system of power. You have a similar authoritarian capitalism in Berlusconi, or you can go all the way to Putin in Russia. But I think that the Chinese example is quite remarkable and unique, in the sense that you have a combination of a state that has all the features of a communist state, and yet consistently acts on behalf of capitalist interests, even against the workers that are supposed to be at the basis of it.
Yeah, I guess on China, a couple of points. One, although it is true that China's total gross domestic product is quite large, but China has a lot of people. You know, on a per capita basis, China remains quite poor on average. Compared to the US, per capita GDP is a third or a quarter as high as the US. Now, I'm not saying China's not interesting, it's not important, it's not even in some senses a threat or something, but it remains a country that was very poor, and since it has adopted some capitalist behaviors in some contexts, has become much richer, but remains still quite poor on a per capita basis. So that's sort of one thing about China and its relative affluence. Because the other thing I think about when China comes up is that, well, it is nice to have inexpensive goods for American consumers. And that is a benefit. You know, go to Old Navy. I play Old Navy bingo. I go and I walk around to see how many continents I can find the labels, you know, made in. And how many continents might these clothes have been made? And usually I can come up with 3, 4, sometimes 5 continents. And these inexpensive products are a great benefit to domestic consumers.
And so, Antonio, do you have a view on whether those benefits to domestic consumers are coming at the expense of Chinese workers, or are in a sense a benefit for them moving from rural poverty to less impoverished urban environments and working in factories producing those T-shirts?
Well, I mean, it's complicated, and I wish that I knew more about the internal condition of workers in China to answer that question. So, I mean, I don't know enough about it to give a conclusive answer. But what I do know is that part of this international division of labor, sure, does it have sometimes an impact on the material well-being of an individual that is otherwise in a remote area and might get a job in a place in which the cost of living is so low, and that might enhance the everyday life of that particular individual? Sure, probably. However, it seems to me that the inequalities are just reproduced at a different level. More importantly, you know, if you turn the tables on that question and perhaps broach on the issue of the environment, for example, right? Then you have to ask yourself is, to what extent getting these cheap goods here that we can afford is predicated precisely on keeping the levels of development elsewhere at a very low level? Because quite frankly, let's admit it, if everybody were to live the American standard of living, the planet would probably disappear fairly quickly if we are going to all get our SUVs and live in the big houses, so on and so forth. I mean, so that's another important layer here. So, you know, at that point, you're dealing with asymmetries of power and economic development and the extent to which you can have, I think that I hear pundits say this expression of China being the workshop of the world, or some kind of like large factory. But for me, it's like, okay, yeah, but that's not a good thing, right? You know, to what extent are we paying attention to what happens within the workshop, to whether or not there are any possibility for mobility, which is one of the so-called virtues of capitalism, so on and so forth. Yeah.
So let's say a miracle did happen and could happen, that Chinese people do become more or less as wealthy per capita as Americans. What happens then, Joel? Are we reliant on a system now which is a temporary system where basically some people's incomes have not converged worldwide, and you know, is the game up, right, when everybody becomes as rich, or will we have destroyed the world by that point? I guess is a further question, but your view on that?
Oh, my view on that is that richer Chinese consumers would import a lot more stuff. Europe and the US would be big beneficiaries of that, especially if the government liberalized and allowed them to do so.
And the environmental question, or do people have a question they'd like to come to?
Yeah.
Do people have, has anyone written any questions that they'd like me to read or that they would like to present? I see some people writing. Yeah?
Yeah.
Given that success as well as failure within this capitalist society is so highly individualized, what or how does this affect the overall quality of life for Americans vis-a-vis that of citizens in other industrialized nations? Speaking as an American, we just don't seem very happy, so.
So global happiness, and Joel, I'll let you respond first since you wanted to say something about the environment briefly before.
Sure, yeah, just a quick thought about the environment. I mean, if I'm not sure which column to put China in, but to the extent that China is degrading the environment, you know, in a way that's even worse than the US, you know, that would tend to argue that somehow the US, that our capitalist democracy is able to respond with regulatory responses in a way that perhaps a more dictatorial, again, I'm not quite sure how to describe China, but it's not clear that this non-capitalist, non-democratic way of organizing is a better steward of the environment than a capitalist democracy. anyways, then this question, I didn't.
Well, I guess the question, to paraphrase your question and let me know if I get it wrong, how is capitalism playing out in terms of people's general happiness in America compared to other capitalist countries? In fact, I think was your question, so in Europe and elsewhere, or... So in a sense, capitalism might be making people happier only when they succeed at capitalism, would be one way of putting it.
It seems like it seems to breed a deal of insecurity.
Right.
I have a friend who's moved to the suburbs, and there's a man who lives across the street from her who makes it a point to go to the woman next door, whom he occasionally makes cry because he talks about the level of grass, where the grass is on her property, and how it looks next to his property. And of course, what he's thinking about, what about the value of my property? And myself, with my husband being a recent owner of a small apartment, my husband says, what about the value of this property? What will the value of this property be in 5 years? What will the value of this property be in 15 years? We can't have the stadium leave because it would affect the value of our property. You know, what happens across the street? So it's an interesting way to construct an existence, to think about constantly what I own and my property is being linked absolutely to, you know, to be trite, the meaning of my life. I mean, it's a little heavy.
I like this question. So who wants to take on the meaning of life question? This is a good way of ending. 42, right?
Should I? Oh, well, so a great kind of bundle of questions there. Let me talk a little bit about sort of capitalism and happiness. I think, first of all, to the extent, if you buy my evidence that capitalism gives rise to higher standard of living than alternative arrangements, and I think most people would buy that, that doesn't get you to happiness, but it gets you to not misery, right, for the vast majority of people. Happiness is a different issue. Now, the tradition or the history of research on happiness and sort of wealth is an interesting one. For a long time, people believed what was called the Easterlin evidence that income was not related to happiness. But more recent careful reexaminations of the data have suggested that in higher income, both in higher income countries compared to lower income countries and in situations in countries where the income grows relative to what it was before, that higher income does seem to be related to reported happiness. Now that's much more intuitive to me, although in some ways I think a lot of people were enamored with the traditional Easterlin paradox. So I think, you know, both on not misery and even on happiness, capitalism tends to do pretty well. Not for everyone, but for sort of most people. On the other question, the more of the meaning of life question, just a quick thought about that. So obsessing about the value of one's house, you know, as is affected, say, by whether the Vikings leave town or what people across the street are doing, if you took out the value from that and just asked, well, am I concerned what's happening across the street? That would seem like a pro-community good thing. Am I concerned whether we have institutions in town that we all enjoy? That would seem like a good thing. Somehow when it comes down to thinking about it as money, it sounds like a venal or bad thing, but maybe that's just a summary for the legitimate and healthy concern about the good things happening next door and nearby. So I'm not so sure that I'm as upset about it as you are. Your life's fine.
Yeah. Antonio?
But just on that for one sentence would be, if it's affecting you, it's affecting your neighbor. If it's about the Vikings, let's say, whatever effect it's having on your property values, it's having on everyone's property values nearby. So again, your focus on your bottom line is by extension, a focus on other people's, whether you mean it to be or not. So maybe it's healthy only by accident.
Well, but I mean, that's exactly the problem, right? I think insofar as the only way to articulate any common concern has to be framed in terms of profitability, in terms of whether or not the value of X or Y is being increased or decreased, and and that all works out for the greater good, right? Well, you see, this is precisely what my problem is, that I think that those ideas of the quality of life need not be understood or framed in terms of this profitability or market-oriented kind of language, right? And which doesn't mean that you don't have some idea of, well, if my property doesn't go down, then the whole neighborhood is going to stay at a different, at a high level, and everybody's going to make equity, and that's my contribution for the common good, right? That's one way of looking at it. But for me, that's a rather restrictive way of even looking at quality of life. Now, the question of the meaning of life, I'm trying to remember this great comedy show from, Monty Python has this great thing about the meaning of life. Well, I don't know what the meaning of life is. What I do know is that, for me, I'm not so sure that everybody's standard of living, that the vast majority of people in a capitalist society have a fairly good standard of living. Actually, my experience is that most people are one paycheck away from being homeless, right? And including myself, by the way. So in that regard, it seems to me that that's part of the instability and the vulnerability that is built into that, which is yet another of the ways in which market imperatives are felt and experienced. I mean, when one speaks of market imperatives, it sounds very abstract, but it isn't really. I mean, it's part of our decision-making and the ways in which we organize our lives on a daily basis.
So we have a few minutes left but before we wrap up, and I know it's completely impossible to follow up the meaning of life question. But with that said, if there are other questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. A brave man. Yeah, absolutely. If other people want to address comments in a row as well, and then our discussants will respond collectively.
Okay, I'm just going to try to bring it back to I guess the butcher and the baker at the beginning, and you kind of think about in the original kind of Smithian world, it's the butcher and the baker and the brewer aren't looking out for their self-interest, but I mean, isn't it in that same world they're also, maybe going to the same pub, and their kids go to the same school, and they might go to the same church on Sunday. Whereas today, the butcher is maybe Tyson Chicken, and the brewer is InBev, and and they're all not even necessarily people, and they're all not even necessarily in the same place. So I guess kind of my question is it appropriate to kind of extend kind of Smith's insights into the capitalism we have today, or is it just, or do we need to find a new rationale that doesn't kind of depend on this Smithian world, which for the most part doesn't particularly exist anymore? Thank you.
Any other comments that people would like to add on top, and we'll have responses? Yep.
I have one that's a little bit rambling, but I'll give it a go, which is related to...
You're the curator, you can do what you
want. Get to the water you want.
It's related to a sort of an offhand comment Joel made earlier about, well, that's a problem with democracy, not capitalism. And thinking that, what's kind of feels might be missing from that kind of understanding is the idea that at this point in history, say, just to take the US as an example, we might be at a stage where the capitalism has become so corrupted that it's actually sort of devouring the democratic system. That the problem with democracy is actually something that's that is a product of the problems with capitalism, which is not to imply that I think there's an obvious ideological sort of alternative. And when you go back to the New Deal and the Great Depression and so on, and think of, what came after that with kind of greater regulation of banks and so on, and how kind of capitalism to an extent corrected itself for a while. I'm kind of wondering, are we at a stage where that can happen anymore? And, when you look at the Congress and you look at the society, it feels like there are no mechanisms with which you know, say, corporate power, lobbyist power within Congress when people are arguing about bills and so on can be rolled back, or the kind of funding of presidential elections, or when we talk about the Tea Party and the right being the reaction now, whereas, say, during the Great Depression you had the left, well, then you have to look at the eradication of the public sphere, of like, you know, network television and newspapers, and, you know, being held in the hands of very few people who are, you know, determined capitalists, you know, and the Tea Party being, you know, quite sort of openly and obviously sort of, and I'm not trying to deny that anger and say that it isn't very real, but being set up through mechanisms like Fox News and the Koch brothers, and these aren't sort of fantasies. You know, Glenn Beck is sort of like the, you know, the highest icon within that movement, you know. So, so I'm wondering, you know, where is the space to address the fact that democracy is not functioning and cannot function with this kind of excess of capitalism that is emerging and becoming ever more dominant?
And I think we have at least one more comment.
That was my question too.
It's not a town hall unless someone says, that's my question. Do we have any other comments on top, since we did have 3? Okay, well, I think we're sort of approaching the end here, so what I might ask both participants to do is to respond to those questions and wrap up what they would like to say. And then after this event, what we will do is, I believe, head outside towards where the burgers and beers section of the, that's always what a Brit will head for, outside the walk near the sculpture garden, and we can continue the conversation there. But of course, let's allow our participants to respond.
Okay, so on the sort of the lost world of the baker who knew the brewer and so forth, I share a feeling about that. But when I think about Smith, I mean, Smith's Pin Factory, I mean, the wonderful, or sort of the perfect example of Smith's Pin Factory is the InBev brewery, right? I mean, they make lots of gallons and barrels of beer with not too many workers, and therefore beer is quite inexpensive for us beer consumers. So in some sense, it's a perfect illustration of Smith's, you know, preachings on the virtues of scale. But I mean, you're right. There's something lost somehow if we're not. And I think we do see markets heal themselves in the sense that people who want local things, express a desire for that, are willing to pay extra for it. And we see sort of a new growth of local stuff. We won't see local automobile production, but local restaurants and things like that. The second and third sort of questions are tougher, but you know, democracy and capitalism is so corrupt that it infects democracy. Wow. Can capitalism correct itself? I mean, so one example, I can't answer this in the broad, but certainly one interesting recent example that came up earlier is in the wake of this financial crisis, there's real talk of a financial regulatory commission. In fact, I think it's going to happen. And that is an interesting development because, again, the rationale for that is much like the rationale for the Food and Drug Administration, that we think there are products too complicated for people to understand by themselves, and so we're going to set up a new sort of regulatory body to prevent people from harming themselves. That's a new rationale for a non-medical sort of product. And so I'd say that that's some evidence that there's some ability to correct or to respond to problems, and maybe doesn't speak to the larger issue, but it is an interesting isolated example. You know, finally, kind of on the Fox News and Glenn Beck thing, it is true that our media outlets are overwhelmingly owned by a small number of players. As it happens, I do a lot of research on media, but you know, we also have this growth of the internet, and it is very, very possible. It's much easier than it ever was to sort of get your message out there. Whether anybody's going to hear it is a different question, but it's really, it's quite the opposite of a situation where there's an active suppression. You know, if you say something and people want to find it, they can. And so we do have these outlets, these ways for people to broadcast their sentiments, even in this new world. So my summing up point, I guess, would just be, you know, to come back to a couple things. One is, you know, we've talked a lot about sort of bad things we've experienced in the past century, and by definition, we're talking about things that happen under capitalism, but we always have to say, well, compared to what? And I think it's very difficult to imagine an alternative, certainly a radical alternative that organizes production differently. And I think nobody believes at this point that we can organize production in a centralized way. And so once we've moved away from that, we've admitted quite a bit of capitalism into whatever system it is that we're doing, and then it becomes a debate about what's the role of government. which activities are we going to leave to the market? Which activities are we going to intervene on? And that's pretty much the debate we're even having right now today in the US. So I think, I'm not sure if that's a concession that we're closer than we thought, or a sly argument that I just won, but anyways. Thank you.
Go ahead, Antonio.
Yeah. Of course, it has to be construed as somebody winning and somebody losing, right? Yeah. Proving point, yeah. Now, very briefly, I'm always fascinated about this pin factory, and actually I wasn't making that up. I had nightmares of that when I was a freshman in college, and I never had to read that. But the relationship between these producers, so on and so forth, right, and how they relate to each other. Again, one of the things that I always find fascinating is that it takes for granted, even the hypothetical example, that there is a level playing field between the two, right? And that they coexist in the same world, which might be a slightly different way of getting to your question, but it kind of reminded me as I was hearing you ask that question of when I was a grad student. And I used to go to Latin night music, right? Because, a whole bunch of us like to dance salsa and whatnot. So we would show up, and there would be all the people that in the service industry hanging out with the wealthy people from Northampton and some other places. And for 3 hours, we were coexisting in the same place. Of course, when the night was over and the exoticism of the salsa dancing faded away, we all went to our respective places in the political economy and in the social structure.
This would make a really good musical.
Yeah, exactly. So, that doesn't get to your question, but it's kind of like an indirect way of answering, as it were. Well, the question of democracy, I think, is crucial. I think that one argument that can be made, I have made it, and I'm willing to defend it, although we're out of time, which is why I'm bringing it up, is that substantive democracy has never been consistent with capitalism insofar as popular pressure can compromise some of the market principles. More importantly, what we have seen, I think, in the last decades or so is the insulation of a lot of economic decision-making by so-called transnational institutions that have the effect of precisely keeping popular pressure or the possibility of democratic agency off these decision-making processes. This is one, discussions about the EU and the so-called democratic deficit is one aspect of that. Same deal with NAFTA and some of these other treatises in which a lot of the things that have an impact on people's everyday life, the decision-making process is done by elites that are insulated for all intents and purposes from any form of democratic or public accountability. So that's one thing. And I think that in the case of the US, what we increasingly see is what has been called a form of managed democracy and a politics of increasingly defined by small margins or the narcissism of small differences that it seems to me is far from democratic in any substantial way. My closing statement will be actually to borrow a line that I think it was Michael Hart on the event on Thursday, who he wasn't sure if it was Jameson or Zizek, but it was actually Jameson, who said that the fact that we can imagine the collapse of the whole of civilization, that we can imagine the end of the world, but we cannot imagine the end of capitalism, perhaps says more about the poverty of our imagination than of anything else.
Thank you. How to follow you and Jameson simultaneously there. I will do so by knowing the next event as part of the Baby Marx event is rather delightfully Songs, Socialism and Capitalism at an acoustic campfire. So, bring your guitar and sing Wish You Were Here. It's on Thursday, September the 1st at 6 p.m. in the open field. This exhibition is on till the end of November, so 8 p.m. Well, you can bring your guitars and start 2 hours early. This exhibition is on here till the end of November. I encourage you to have a look around now, but we will be going downstairs for drinks and conversation outside. And thank you all for your attendance and your great questions. Thank you to the participants, Joel Waldfogel and Antonio Vazquez-Arroyo, and thank you to Pedro and the curators.